Well, I didn't think that we were going to start in Greenwich, but as I live in this area and hardly ever get on the river, it's a great treat. It's a day out, isn't it, as we've got a nice day.
Is it?
Well, it is for me, yes. I mean, I'm a real Londoner, and I live about 20 minutes away from this river. And I think the last time I came down here was to see the Queen when she sailed by on the barge to open the Woolwich ferry.
What did you come to see that for?
Oh, because I'm a very keen royalist. Where are we going to sit? In the sun?
I don't know. Let's sit. As a Londoner or a Northerner then?
I don't think of myself as anywhere, really. I mean, I tend to think of where I am is where I am, if you see what I mean. And I'm just as happy when I go back to visit relations in the north as I am when I'm in London. I mean, I came to London because that's the place where you had to come in those years to be employed in the theatre. There were no opportunities to be employed anywhere else.
How much does your background affect your character? I mean, it seemed to have affected you quite
I
considerably.
don't know. I mean, that's an argument that will go on and on forever, won't it? I mean, what constitutes genetic implants and what is environment? I wouldn't know. I mean, I suppose if I had to... I mean, in a sense, when you work in the theatre, and if you're lucky, and I have been very lucky, you meet some of the best minds, for instance. I mean, Shakespeare is one, I suppose, one of the greatest minds and souls, in a sense, that you're ever likely to meet. And that is a very... Well, it opens your mind up.
You were quite... Well, you were older, you were a teenager before you were introduced to Shakespeare, so what kind of influences...
Well, I was never a teenager. I mean, I am at the age
No?
when... No, there were no teenagers when I was in what we would now call my teens. You went to school, you left school, you got a job, and then you got married. But there was no in-between time. You were either a child or an adult. I was a limboer, if you like. There was a limbo between leaving school and reaching adulthood.
So why didn't you end up just leaving school and getting married then like everybody else?
Because I was very plain and fat. And within I suppose, the marriage market, I was no kind of contender.
Well, we kind of shared that. I mean, when I was at school, I was taunted horribly because I was very ugly.
Yes.
And I sometimes wonder if that's affected my character in later life. Do you think it's affected yours?
Oh, it's awfully hard to know, isn't it? What really makes you what you are, or indeed even what you are.
Do you feel
But
scarred
yes, I'm
of
sure.
it, really?
No, I don't feel scarred in that sense. But I always did have a sense of knowing that there had to be more to life than I was experiencing, and the possibility that I had more to contribute than I was being asked to give. Mind you, on first nights in theatres, I always say if I'd played my cards right, I could have been an area manager for Boots Cash Chemists now. But that's just fear.
Oh, I think that's being a bit optimistic, Glenda. I mean, it's a pretty hard job.
No, I would have been marvellous.
When you were used to being plain and fat, as you described yourself, and then you were suddenly rocketed into being a sex symbol in some of your early film career. How did you cope with that when men were suddenly regarding you as sexy?
It was a very slow rocket as far as I was concerned. I mean, I had been working, claiming to be an actress for at least 12 years before I did my first film, so it was hardly what I would call an overnight success. And I have to say that aspect of being a sex symbol I just found very funny. But theatre is a curiously asexual profession. I mean, overriding the fact that there is the inbuilt limitation that the best parts are always for men, that really no quarter is given or expected on the ground of being female.
Just encouraging them to see you were encouraging builders
Well,
shouting
no,
at
I
us.
think they were shouting at us out of sympathy more than actual lust.
They're being predatory and revolting, and you have
They were being friendly. Good heavens. I mean, you've got to allow for the human condition, even in men.
But then on a personal level, I mean, presumably you would have to reassess your own sexuality from seeing yourself perhaps as somebody who was asexual on a personal level to suddenly seeing yourself as someone who had enormous sexual attraction and power.
Well, it never expressed itself to me. It seemed at the time the overriding aspect of the work I was doing in films at that time was that I always seemed to take my clothes off. And there seemed, I mean, as far as I was concerned, it was just a succession of films that I didn't really want my mother to see, you know. She'd say, shall I go and see it? Well, she said, do you keep your clothes on in this one? Well, for most of the time, Mum, yes, you know, all that was going on. But I never really met, because when you are working, and I seem to go from one job to the next, you know, you're up at 6 and you're home at 8, and you don't really meet anybody other than the people you work with. And apart from people finding reasons to be on sets when there were nude scenes, who never found reasons to be on sets when we all had our clothes on, there was very little pressure on that level coming at me.
But the whole of, you know, especially when you're a young woman, and you know, even at my age, your sexuality does seem to be based on how it's reflected in men's attitudes to you.
Well, I mean, I haven't experienced that myself. I have seen that happening in people around me. I mean, I have been in rooms with actresses where, you know, I mean, there aren't many plays where they're all female casts, but I have seen it, and suddenly they all spark to life when a man walks into the room. I mean, that kind of thing I've seen and I understand, and I don't particularly like the unalloyed company of only women. I do find that in some way less. But I've never, no, I mean, I've never, it's very hard to be precise in what I'm trying to mean. I think what I mean is that I certainly need a man to feel sexy myself, but it's not just any man, if you see what I mean. I mean, that isn't me being picky or particular. I mean, it simply is that my sexuality, I suppose, expresses itself when I think, you're in with a chance there, girl. You know what I mean?
Is that often?
Sometimes not as often as I'd like, sometimes more than I can be bothered with. You got your land legs back.
I was like stumbling about.
Exactly.
For landing on a quayside in a capital city, it isn't particularly impressive, I have to say.
Well, I suppose it would be more impressive if the tide was out, so we didn't see all the filth down there. I mean, really, considering we have so few river walkways in London, I suppose we shouldn't really bellyache about having this particular little garden area here. I mean, I like those hippopotami in the background. It's all this that's...
And what's all this? Look at this wood stuff here. I mean, what is that supposed to be?
Oh, somebody's carving that, are they? Are they going to carve that into shape?
Would you have that in your house? I wouldn't have that anywhere near my town.
Not even in your garden? You wouldn't have it in your garden?
No,
Home for drilling.
No, I would have one of those real bits
things.
of wood, but not
Right.
ones carved into this kind of hippie thing.
Exactly.
Talking about changes in the 80s, it's going to be looked back on as a very peculiar decade. The thing I've noticed, certainly, in cinema, when we're talking about women, is that it's the age of the bimbo again. Nowadays, cinema seems to be full of fluffy little lassies with blonde hair. I mean,
Well, it's not only the cinema. I mean, having weathered in the British theatre the transformation that Look Back in Anger brought about, in that it did acknowledge that there was a class other than the middle and that there was a region other than the southeast. Now, the only voices you seem to hear issuing from the mouths of comparatively young actresses is what I would call the Sloane Ranger squeak. So I don't know quite how that change has taken place. I mean, with regard to, I mean, I think women are always badly served, and I think they're, even despite the rise of the feminist movement and its particular strengths in America, which I find rather odd, there has been really no equivalent change in cinema. I mean, in fairness, I suppose, quite who I'm being fair to, I'm not sure, all those tough women that I remember loving to watch in the cinema when I was a girl, they all got their comeuppance in the end. They all got punished for having the temerity of wanting a private life and a successful career.
Well, not all of them. I mean, Catherine Hepburn and the African Queen, there was a strong woman and there wasn't a comeuppance there. Mildred Pierce, perhaps, or Joan Crawford, was a bit of a comeuppance, but it was just revealing the vulnerable side of somebody very tough.
Well, there seemed to be an...
Betty
Davies, marvellous Betty Davies.
She
but there always had to
be...
Well, I think they did, in a sense. I mean, they always either lost the man who they truly loved, who would have made their life fulfilled in some way or other, either because someone else took him, or because he died, or because they died. I mean, there was this... I mean, at least for 2/3 of the film, you could see women actually being more than just empty coat hangers. But why there shouldn't have been a change as far as the cinema and the theatre is concerned today, I really don't know. It's most peculiar. I suppose in one sense you can't dictate to a creative writer what they find interesting, and they don't find women interesting.
Do you find the National Theatre interesting? I can't believe it.
Isn't it marvellous? It's like the back of a garage, isn't it?
Well, it has the cultural impact of a motorway intersection.
It's foul. It's this tease-made school of architecture. It's just horrendous.
Why have you never played at the National Theatre?
Well, they've never asked me, really, in any way that was interesting for me to have been able to say yes. I mean, I don't, as a concept, agree with this idea of a national theatre. I mean, I don't think a national theatre should be rooted in a building. I mean, you can have a building if you like, but a national theatre should be a theatre that tours the nation, it seems to me. I would have opted for a great, big, very comfortable bus and a tent that you can inflate very quickly and a constantly touring company. And if you need a building on the South Bank, then allow all those theatres, those few remaining theatres that exist in the provinces to come in and show the kind of work that they're doing to this oversated London audience. But as it's there, I mean, you can't even hope that it'll fall down. It looks as though it's about to. Every time there's a heavy mist, it looks as though it's sprung a leak somewhere. It's absolutely awful, isn't it? And the dressing rooms are marvellous, you know. I mean, it was built as the National Theatre, and they promised us a mixed programme of classic, modern, sort of. And the dressing rooms, there's a rail behind the door, which you can't hang a 20th century dress on without it brushing the floor. So what you do with the costume, I've no idea. They have seats that are fixed to the floor. Well, they did when I visited it. And you know those ashtrays they give you in aeroplanes, which holds 2.5 stubs and it's full to overflowing? They are carefully implanted in the dressing tables. Now, on a first night, I mean, that's neither use nor ornament. So it's not only hideous, it's not particularly effective as a theatre, I think.
The designers of things like the National Theatre always hope there's going to be spaces here where people have street theatre and street things happening.
Oh, good heavens, no. I mean, they don't see the surrounding environment at all. If they did, they wouldn't build the shapes they do. I mean, all they've surrounded the National Theatre with is a succession of wind tunnels. I mean, you're hard-pressed to walk on a balmy summer day. Any poor street theatre entertainer would be blown off their feet.
Maybe living in a festival city like Edinburgh's made me a bit cynical about street theatre. Anyway, I have a rather low tolerance level for mime artists and people with white faces. So, I mean, do you think it's important, these kind of things that happen on the streets?
Well, in a funny way, I do. I mean, I like street musicians very much. I mean, I love walking along a street and all you can hear up to a point is the roar of traffic and the clatter of feet, and then you come across 3 earnest violinists scraping away, and you know they're music students, so you have the pleasure of the music, and you have the pleasure of giving them something because you know they're on a very mean grant. And I like that. I like things happening in the street in that way. We don't see much of it in this country, I think mostly because the weather's too awful. But I love it in New York on a Saturday afternoon when you get a variety of jazz bands. You see, like this. No, I like all this.
You do like this?
I like this.
Would you stand and watch this normally?
No, I don't suppose I would stand and watch it. And I might object strongly if I was sitting having my lunch and wanted a quiet conversation. But for a walk, I like it very much.
Well, I suppose it has its fine time.
I would be more impressed with it if they didn't have microphones, I must admit.
Yes, you're a believer in voice projection. That RADA training has not gone amiss.
Absolutely. Well, I was told it wasn't my RADA training, but somebody said to me once, do you come from a very large family? So I said, why do you ask? She said, you've got such a very loud voice. So I was shouting down on my younger sister, get in here!
About to be made into a hotel.
Oh, it is being made into an
I
hotel.
thought so,
is it?
yes.
No, I thought they would pull it all down and put up another glorious block of flat. Bring back the GLC!
The newts and everything. Would you like an ice cream?
No, thank you.
Have you been a card-carrying member of the Labour Party since you've been a teenager? Why?
No, I don't think since I've been a teenager. I think it's a bit later than that. I mean, I've always voted Labour, and then I suddenly thought, well, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and actually join it and pay your subscription? Is this where we show how brave we are, trying to cross this road? We're very foolhardy, aren't we? You see, if we still had the GLC, they'd have put a zebra crossing here. Yes, we can see you. Ooh.
You were offered a couple of constituencies before, and the chance to become a Labour MP. Why did you decide not to?
Well, when I was offered the constituencies, they were outside London. And at that time, it would have meant uprooting my son from the school that he was very happy at. I would have had to have sold my home, moved to another area, because I think you do have to nurse a constituency. I mean, the people who are actually going to pay you the enormous compliment of voting for you should at least be able to recognise your face.
Is it still an option if someone were to offer you a constituency that were manageable within
yes,
London?
absolutely. Yeah? I mean, I think the most important thing is that this country should have a socialist government, and anything I can do to support that, I will. And if a constituency does offer what is a great compliment to say, listen, we think, you know, you might be able to fight this constituency and win for us, then obviously, yes, I would give that very serious consideration. Now, I've never felt ashamed of being British before, but I felt deeply ashamed of being British over the past few years.
What in particular is where you feel ashamed?
Well, where I feel the sense of shame particularly is that we used to be a society. It seemed to me that we did have a sense of a society, of a social grouping whereby people could come together, in a sense, and where if you couldn't afford something specifically, then the taxes of everybody else could pay for you. We've seen the welfare state shot to ribbons. We see education up for grabs. There are constant attacks being made upon the health service. The ecology has been let go to rack and ruin. Those kind of things. And the fact that, you know, our kids who've been made refugees in their own country by direct government policies are having to sleep in cardboard boxes and plastic bags, half a mile from the Palace of Westminster as far as London is concerned, and I'm sure in every major city up and down the country. And also our total lack of care for what you could call the third world. I mean, I was in Ethiopia during the Great Famine, doing a documentary for Oxfam. I didn't see one sack of grain that said a gift from the people of the United Kingdom.
And yet look how generous they were when asked to be, by Bob Geldof, for instance. So it's not the will of the people that's being...
Absolutely not. It was a political governmental decision because the government of Ethiopia was Marxist. You punish the people twice. If you truly believe that Marxism is a bad form of government, why do you punish them twice?
Are you a Kinnockite, though? I mean, there's...
Well, I'm a middle of the road. I mean, I'm neither extreme right nor extreme left. And if that is a definition of, oh, what are these people? The burghers of Calais, is it?
Yes, how did you know that?
I must have seen a photograph of them somewhere.
Is it even the thought that you had wanted to be a social worker at one time? I just wonder where that enormous compassionate imagination comes from.
Because I do firmly believe that many of the social ills that we see around us every day can be prevented. I mean, I do believe in an egalitarian society, and that is not, as many people would argue, a levelling down. I mean, socialism has never offered to make people poor. It is in an attempt to eradicate the extremes of poverty that socialism came about. And that is what I deeply believe, and that's what I believe this country could stand for. And it has to do with moral justice and natural justice, and not simply might always being right, or those who have having, and those who haven't, the devil take the hindmost. I mean, success has been limited to a particular area. I mean, it has to do with money and balance sheets. I mean, she's always making great claims, you know, that she's a marvelous housekeeper, governments have no money, that she's managing our money brilliantly. Well, indeed, there may be a sizable bank balance, but the roof is leaking, there are rats in the cellar, the garden's overgrown, the road is potholed. I mean, that doesn't strike me as being good housekeeping on any level whatsoever.
Where does your compassion come from? Do you have a religious upbringing, or is it more humanitarian?
No, I don't think I have a religious upbringing. I mean, I think I did stick my toe in most of the religions in the particular area that I lived in when I was a child. I'm not sure whether I believe in a God or not, but I definitely do believe that there is something in the individual which responds to something greater than the senses that envelop us. I mean, we do have some kind of aspiration to something that we can neither see, nor smell, nor touch, nor feel. I mean, we all have that within us. And I think that sense is part of what makes a society work, when it can be harnessed, when it can be that sense, on one level, if you like, of realizing that there are greater similarities between human beings than there are differences.
What is that intangible thing, then, if it isn't a God?
I honestly don't know. I mean, if it was possible to put it into words precisely for me, other than that of actually saying, okay, it's God, then it wouldn't be intangible because I would have a word for it, but I don't.
Why are we so desperate for something else?
Oh, because we're so little, aren't we? I mean, it's very lonely being a human being, even when you're in the middle of a crowd, isn't it? I mean, I think that sense of the solitariness of the individual and the difficulties that it is, even with people who are near and dear to you, to actually express what is most important to you. I can well understand that we would like to think that there is something, that there's a big daddy up in the sky who's actually going to take care of everything.
Do you feel that? Do you feel that isolation?
I don't feel isolated, but I do, I mean, I do agree with Chekhov. We come in alone and we go out alone, and I think an awful lot of the life in between is alone in that sense, without being lonely.
Have you had a happy life or a lonely one?
You make it sound as though I'm about to die. I'm not quite in the past tense yet. I'm not, how can I put this? I believe a Mediterranean blessing that is said at the christening of a child, that may they know all the happiness, all the laughter and all the tears. And that seems to me an ideal gift to give a child. I think we're neurotically afraid of unhappiness in Western societies. And I don't think you can have the one without the other. And I think the thing you can be most grateful for is to have a life that's been as full as it's possible to be, and to have a sense that you've actually done something with it.
Are you going to continue doing something with it?
I hope so. I hope so.
If you don't make it into politics, will that be a frustration?
Well, I think it would be a fool who thought you would possibly be elected the first time out. I mean, if people still showed an interest, if constituents still showed an interest, I would like to try again.
Will you kiss babies, Glenda?
I love babies. It's no hardship for me to kiss them.